She stood now at the edge of Lord Pemberton's great hall, pressed against the cold stone wall as though hoping it might swallow her whole. Around her, the annual winter ball swirled in a dazzling display of silk and velvet, of jewels catching candlelight, of laughter ringing like silver bells across the vaulted ceiling. Ladies in elaborate headdresses glided across the floor on the arms of lords in fine doublets. Servants wove through the crowd bearing trays of spiced wine and honeyed cakes. Musicians played from the gallery above, their melodies filling every corner of the vast space. And Alara stood alone, as she always stood alone, as she had stood alone at every ball for 3 long years. She was 24 years old, a widow since the age of 21, and possessed of a quiet beauty that might have been remarkable if anyone had bothered to look at her long enough to notice. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, a deep auburn that gleamed with hidden fire in the candlelight. Her eyes were gray-green, changeable as the sea, and held within them a sadness that she had learned to hide behind a mask of calm composure. Her gown was the same one she had worn to every ball for the past 2 years, a simple dress of dark green wool that had been fine once, but now showed its age in the fading of its color and the careful mending at its seams. No one looked at her gown. No one looked at her at all. Alara had learned to count the ways in which she was ignored. There was the deliberate turning of backs when she approached a group in conversation. There was the sudden fascination with the contents of a wine goblet when she tried to catch someone's eye. There was the way invitations to dance somehow never reached her ears, though she stood close enough to hear every word. There was the laughter that fell silent when she drew near, only to resume the moment she moved away. She had become expert at reading these signals, at understanding the language of exclusion that the nobility spoke so fluently. She knew that Lady Blackwood, who stood now surrounded by admirers near the great fireplace, had once been her friend, or so Alara had believed. They had grown up together on neighboring estates, had played in the same meadows and shared the same tutors. But that friendship had evaporated like morning mist the moment Alara's husband died, leaving her with nothing but debts and a name that had never been quite good enough. She knew that Lord Ashworth, who was even now leading Lady Catherine Pemberton onto the dance floor, had once asked for her hand in marriage. That was before, of course. Before she had married Edmund Weston, a knight of modest means and no particular distinction. Before Edmund had died in a hunting accident, leaving her alone in a world that had no place for penniless widows of no important family. She knew that the whispers that followed her wherever she went spoke of her pride, her coldness, her refusal to accept her diminished place in the world with appropriate humility. They said she held her head too high. They said she looked at her betters with eyes that did not know their proper place. They said she was too proud to beg for patronage, too stubborn to accept the charity that might have eased her circumstances. They did not say that she had tried. They did not say that she had swallowed her pride and approached Lady Blackwood for help, only to be told that their friendship had been a childhood fancy, nothing more. They did not say that she had written to her husband's family, asking for the support that should have been hers by right, only to receive a letter informing her that Edmund's debts had consumed whatever inheritance might have been left. They did not say that she had spent the last 3 years surviving on needlework and determination, mending gowns for the same women who looked through her as though she were made of glass. Tonight was the 5th ball she had attended this season. She came because the invitations still arrived, carried by messengers who did not know or did not care that she was no longer truly welcome. She came because some stubborn part of her refused to disappear entirely, refused to surrender the last vestiges of the life she had once known. She came because if she stopped coming, she would have nothing left at all. But tonight, something was different. Alara had noticed it the moment she entered the hall. There was a tension in the air, an undercurrent of excitement that had nothing to do with the usual pleasures of the season. People were whispering with unusual intensity, their eyes darting toward the far end of the hall where a group of strangers stood in a small cluster, their clothing marking them as visitors from somewhere far away. "Have you heard?" Lady Blackwood's voice carried across the space, sharp with the particular delight she took in sharing news. "The Duke of Ashworth has died. His nephew has inherited. They say he is coming to England to claim his estates." "The Duke of Ashworth?" Lady Catherine Pemberton's voice was breathless with interest. But the old Duke was a recluse, No one has seen him in 20 years. Precisely. And now he is dead, and his nephew, who has been living abroad all this time, is finally coming home. Lady Blackwood's smile was knowing, predatory. They say he is unmarried, and very, very wealthy. Alara turned away from the conversation, a bitter smile touching her lips. A wealthy, unmarried duke. The entire ballroom would be in a frenzy of competition within the hour, every eligible lady positioning herself to catch his eye, every mother calculating her daughter's chances. It was the way of the world, and Alara had long since accepted that she had no part in it. She moved toward the doors that led to the garden, seeking the cold air and the silence that awaited beyond. She had learned to find comfort in solitude, to prefer the company of stars and frost to the empty chatter of people who did not see her. She would stay for another hour, perhaps, just long enough to maintain the fiction that she still belonged here, and then she would return to her small room above the seamstress's shop where she earned her meager living. But as she reached the doors, a voice stopped her. "You are leaving so soon?" Alara turned, startled. A man stood behind her, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a traveling cloak of dark blue wool that marked him as one of the strangers who had arrived that evening. His face was partially shadowed by the hood he had not yet removed, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and the glint of dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Yes, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I find I have little appetite for dancing this evening." "That is a shame." The stranger moved closer, and Alara caught the scent of wood smoke and winter air clinging to his clothes. "I had hoped to ask you for a dance myself." Alara stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You wish to dance with me? Is that so surprising?" "Forgive me, but yes, it is." She gestured toward the crowded hall behind them. "There are 100 ladies here tonight who would be honored by your attention. Ladies of wealth and position and beauty. I am none of those things." The stranger reached up and pushed back his hood, revealing a face that was not handsome in the conventional sense, but possessed of a compelling strength that drew the eye and held it. His hair was dark, touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky just before snowfall. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 35, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. "You are wrong," he said quietly, "about all of it, but particularly about beauty." Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away. "You are kind, sir, but I am not kind. I am honest." He extended his hand toward her. "My name is Aldrich Ashworth. I have just arrived from France, and I find myself in need of a guide to this bewildering world of English nobility. Will you help me?" Aldrich Ashworth. The name struck Alara like a physical blow. She looked up at him, at his dark eyes and his patient smile, and understanding dawned. "You are the new Duke," she breathed. "I am, though I confess I am not yet accustomed to the title." His hand remained extended, waiting. "And you are Alara Weston, widow of Sir Edmund Weston, and the only person in this room who has not been trying to catch my attention all evening. How do you know my name?" "Because I asked. I saw you standing alone by the wall, watching everyone with those extraordinary eyes, and I asked who you were. Do you know what they told me?" Alara could imagine. She shook her head silently. "They told me you were nobody, a widow of no consequence, a woman who should not even be here." His voice hardened slightly, and she saw something flash in his eyes that might have been anger. "They told me to ignore you as they do. And yet you did not." "No, I did not." He took a step closer, and his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "Because I have spent my life in courts and ballrooms across Europe, and I have learned to recognize the difference between those who matter and those who pretend to matter. The ones who pretend are loud and bright and constantly in motion, demanding attention with every breath. The ones who truly matter are quiet. They stand apart. They watch and listen and understand. Like you." Alara did not know what to say. No one had spoken to her like this in 3 years. No one had looked at her as though she were worth looking at. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back with an effort that cost her more than she would have admitted. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I am going to ask you to dance," Aldrich said. "And when I do, every person in this hall will see us. They will whisper. They will speculate. They will wonder what the new Duke of Ashworth could possibly see in a widow of no consequence. And I want you to understand, before you accept or refuse, that I do not care what they think. I have not cared about the opinions of society since I was old enough to recognize them for the empty performances they are." He extended his hand once more, and this time, after a long moment of hesitation, Alara took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and she felt something shift inside her, some wall she had built around her heart developing its first crack. "Shall we give them something to talk about?" Aldrich asked. And Alara, who had been invisible for 3 years, who had stood at the edges of 100 gatherings and watched the world dance past her without acknowledgement, lifted her chin and smiled. "Yes," she said. "Let us." Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These stories of courage, dignity, and love that triumphs against all odds deserve to be shared. Subscribe now and never miss a moment of Alara's remarkable journey from invisible widow to the woman who captured a duke's heart. The moment Aldrich led Alara onto the dance floor, the hall fell silent. It was not a gradual quieting, not the natural ebb and flow of conversation that accompanied the beginning of a new dance. It was a sudden, shocked silence, as though every person in the room had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. The musicians continued to play, their melody floating above the stunned crowd like a voice speaking into a void. Alara felt the weight of every gaze upon her. She saw Lady Blackwood's mouth fall open in undisguised astonishment. She saw Lord Ashworth, the other Lord Ashworth, her former suitor, go pale with something that might have been jealousy or might have been rage. She saw Lady Catherine Pemberton clutch her mother's arm, her carefully practiced smile crumbling into an expression of pure bewilderment. And she saw, reflected in the faces all around her, the same thought crossing every mind. How? How is this possible? How is the invisible widow standing in the center of the floor with the most eligible man in England? "They are staring," she murmured to Aldrich as he positioned his hand at her waist. "Let them stare." His voice was calm, almost amused. "I have found that being the object of scandal is far more entertaining than being the observer of it." "You have experience with scandal?" "My dear Lady Weston, I have made scandal my life's work." He began to lead her through the steps of the dance, his movements confident and assured. "Why do you think I stayed abroad for so long? I had no desire to inherit my uncle's title. I was quite content to live in Paris, surrounded by artists and philosophers and other disreputable persons. But death has a way of changing one's plans." Alara followed his lead, her body remembering the steps even though it had been years since she had danced with anyone. "You did not wish to be Duke?" "I wish to be free. There is a difference." His eyes met hers, dark and searching. "But I find that the expectations of duty have a way of catching up with us, no matter how far we run." Around them, the other dancers had begun to move again, though Alara could still feel the intensity of attention focused upon them. Whispers followed them as they turned, voices rising and falling like waves against a shore. "Cannot believe he would. Who does she think she is? Heard she mends clothes for a living now? Absolute disgrace." Alara tried to ignore the words, but they struck her like blows, each one a reminder of everything she had lost. She felt her composure waver, her steps faltering for just a moment. "Do not listen to them," Aldrich said quietly. "Their words have no power unless you give it to them." Easy to say when you are a duke. Easier than you might think when you have spent your life on the outside of these circles, watching them from a distance. He guided her through a turn, bringing them closer together. "I was not raised to be an heir, Alara. I was the third son of a third son, so far removed from the title that no one ever expected me to inherit. I grew up poor by noble standards, educated by charity, dependent on the goodwill of relatives who resented my very existence. Alara looked at him with new eyes. I did not know. How could you? The story they tell is simpler, more palatable. The mysterious duke who lived abroad waiting for his moment. They do not speak of the boy who wore his cousin's cast-off clothing and was reminded at every meal that he ate only by the sufferance of his betters. The music swelled, and Aldrich drew her closer still, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body through the thin fabric of her gown. I know what it is to be invisible, he said softly. I know what it is to stand at the edges and watch the world celebrate without you. And I know what it is to survive, to endure, to emerge from darkness with your dignity intact. Alara felt the tears threatening again, and this time she could not entirely hold them back. One escaped, tracing a silent path down her cheek. Aldrich caught it with his thumb, the touch so gentle it made her heart ache. That is why I noticed you, he said. Because I recognized myself. The dance ended, the music faded, and for a long moment, Alara and Aldrich stood motionless at the center of the floor, oblivious to the crowd around them, lost in a connection that defied explanation. Then the spell broke. Lady Blackwood descended upon them, her face arranged in an expression of saccharine warmth that did not reach her calculating eyes. Your Grace, she exclaimed, inserting herself between Aldrich and Alara with practiced ease. What an honor to finally meet you. I am Lady Blackwood. We are neighbors, you know. Our estates share a border, and I simply must insist that you join us for refreshments. Lady Catherine has been dying to make your acquaintance. Aldrich's expression did not change, but Alara saw something cool enter his eyes. Lady Blackwood, how unexpected. We have prepared a private salon for just such occasions, Lady Blackwood continued, already attempting to steer him away. Much more comfortable than this crush, and Lady Catherine is such charming company. I am certain she is. Aldrich extracted himself from Lady Blackwood's grip with a deftness that spoke of long practice. However, I find myself quite content with my current company. Lady Blackwood's smile flickered. But surely, Lady Weston has graciously agreed to show me the garden. Aldrich extended his hand to Alara once more. The night air, I find, is far more restorative than crowded salons. Before Lady Blackwood could formulate a response, Aldrich had swept Alara toward the doors that led to the garden, leaving chaos in their wake. The cold air struck Alara's heated cheeks like a blessing. She drew a deep breath, tasting frost and wood smoke, and felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. Behind them, she could hear the buzz of conversation rising to a fever pitch, but here in the moonlit garden, there was only silence and stars. You did not have to do that, she said quietly. Lady Blackwood will make a formidable enemy. Lady Blackwood has been my enemy since the moment I inherited my uncle's title. Aldrich walked beside her along a path of crushed stone, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She wrote to me in France, you know, before I even knew my uncle was dead, offering her daughter's hand in marriage, along with a detailed accounting of the considerable dowry that would accompany her. Alara could not help but laugh. She does not waste time. No, she does not. And when I did not respond with immediate enthusiasm, she wrote again, and again. Each letter more insistent than the last. He shook his head, a wry smile curving his lips. I came to England prepared to dislike her intensely, and I find that she has exceeded my expectations. They had reached a small fountain at the center of the garden, its waters frozen into fantastic shapes by the winter cold. Alara paused, looking up at the stars scattered across the velvet sky. Why me? She asked. Of all the women in that hall, that women with wealth, with connections, with beauty that would make any man's head turn, why did you choose to dance with me? Aldrich was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. Because you were the only one not performing. Alara turned to look at him. Every other woman in that room was playing a part, he explained. Smiling when they did not feel like smiling. Laughing at jests they did not find amusing. Positioning themselves, calculating, strategizing, It was exhausting just to watch. He met her eyes, and the intensity of his gaze made her pulse quicken. But you stood by the wall, and you watched, and you did not pretend. You did not try to catch my eye or ingratiate yourself with my companions. You were simply yourself. I was invisible, Alara corrected quietly. That is not the same as being myself, is it not? Aldrich stepped closer, close enough that she could see the moonlight reflected in his dark eyes. I think, perhaps, that you have been hiding. I think you have made yourself small because the world told you that you had no right to take up space. But hiding is not the same as being invisible. Somewhere beneath that armor of composure, the real Alara Weston is waiting, and I find myself very curious to meet her. Alara did not know how to respond. No one had ever seen through her so clearly, had ever looked past the mask she wore and sensed the woman beneath. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely exhilarated, as though a door she had kept locked for years was finally beginning to open. You do not know me, she said, and her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. No, Aldrich agreed. Not yet, but I would very much like to. He reached out and took her hand, raising it to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her cold fingers was gentle, almost reverent. Will you allow me to call upon you tomorrow, Lady Weston? Alara should have refused. She knew the rules of society well enough to understand what his attention would mean, the scandal it would create, the enemies it would make. She knew that Lady Blackwood and her ilk would do everything in their power to destroy her, to prove that she was unworthy of a duke's notice. But she also knew that she had spent 3 years being careful, being proper, being everything the world expected of a powerless widow. And it had earned her nothing but loneliness and invisibility. Perhaps it was time to stop being careful. Yes, she said. You may call upon me. Aldrich smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Alara's heart turn over in her chest. It was not the polished, practiced smile of a nobleman performing for his audience. It was something real, something warm, something that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in years. Until tomorrow, then, he said. And Alara, who had been ignored at every ball, who had learned to expect nothing and hope for less, found herself believing that perhaps, just perhaps, her story was not over after all. The days that followed Lord Pemberton's ball were unlike any Alara had known since her husband's death. True to his word, Aldrich called upon her the next morning, arriving at the seamstress's shop where she worked with such disregard for propriety that Mrs. Thornton, her employer, nearly fainted from shock. He came again the next day, and the day after that, each visit longer than the last, each conversation deeper and more revealing. They talked of everything, of his years in France, wandering from city to city, seeking purpose in art and philosophy and the company of those who lived outside society's rigid expectations, of her marriage to Edmund, a kind man who had loved her in his own quiet way but had never truly understood her, of the dreams they had each abandoned and the walls they had each built, and the loneliness that had shaped them both into the people they were today. But as the connection between them deepened, so too did the hostility of those who watched. Lady Blackwood, true to her nature, had not accepted her defeat with grace. In the week following the ball, Alara found herself the subject of whispers wherever she went. Stories circulated through the town with the speed of wildfire, each more vicious than the last. They said she had bewitched the Duke with dark arts. They said she had seduced him for his money. They said she had been his mistress in France, that she had followed him to England to claim what she believed was owed to her. None of it was true, but truth had never been a requirement for scandal. The culmination of Lady Blackwood's campaign came on the night of Lady Catherine Pemberton's birthday ball, an event that had been anticipated for months and to which Alara had received a pointed non-invitation. She had not planned to attend, had resigned herself to another evening alone in her small room when a messenger arrived with a note in Aldrich's handwriting. You will come tonight. I will not let them erase you. And so Alara had dressed in her finest gown, still the same faded green, still bearing the marks of careful mending, and made her way to Pemberton Manor, knowing that she was walking into a trap but unable to stay away. The moment she entered the ballroom, she knew something was wrong. The usual hum of conversation fell silent, but this silence was different from the one that had greeted her dance with Aldrich. There was anticipation in it, a barely suppressed glee that made her stomach clench with foreboding. Lady Blackwood stepped forward from the crowd, her smile sharpening into something predatory. "Lady Weston, what a surprise. I was not aware you had been invited." "I was not," Alara said, keeping her voice steady. "I came at His Grace's request." "His Grace?" Lady Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "How convenient. And yet His Grace does not appear to be here." Alara looked around the ballroom, searching for Aldrich's familiar figure. He was nowhere to be seen. The clenching in her stomach tightened into something closer to fear. "No matter," Lady Blackwood continued, her voice rising to carry across the room. "Since you are here, perhaps you might enlighten us on a matter of some curiosity. You see, we have been hearing the most fascinating stories about you, Lady Weston. Stories that paint quite a different picture from the dignified widow you present yourself to be." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. "I do not know what you mean." "Do you not?" Lady Blackwood reached into the folds of her gown and produced a sheaf of papers. "Then perhaps these will refresh your memory. Letters, Lady Weston. Letters written in your own hand to a certain gentleman in London. Letters that speak of, shall we say, intimate services rendered in exchange for financial considerations." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Alara stared at the papers in Lady Blackwood's hand, her mind reeling. "Those are not mine. I never wrote." "The handwriting has been confirmed by 3 separate experts." Lady Blackwood's smile widened. "It seems, my dear Lady Weston, that you are not quite the proper widow you have pretended to be. It seems you have been supporting yourself in ways that no decent woman would acknowledge." "That is a lie." Alara's voice shook despite her best efforts to control it. "Those letters are forgeries. I have never—" "A forgery? How convenient." Lady Blackwood turned to the crowd, arms spread in theatrical appeal. "You see how she denies it? How she clings to her pretense of respectability? But the evidence speaks for itself. This woman, who has somehow bewitched His Grace into paying her attention, is nothing more than a— That is quite enough." The voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, silencing Lady Blackwood mid-sentence. Alara turned, and there in the doorway stood Aldrich, still in his traveling clothes, his face dark with barely contained fury. He strode across the room, the crowd parting before him like water before a ship's prow. He did not stop until he stood directly before Lady Blackwood, so close that she was forced to take a step backward. "Those letters," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "were commissioned by you. I have the testimony of the forger who created them, signed and witnessed by 3 magistrates. I have records of the payments you made to secure this performance tonight. And I have the original letters, still in the possession of their true author, which prove beyond any doubt that Lady Weston had nothing to do with them." Lady Blackwood's face went white. "That is impossible. How could you— Did you think I would not investigate? Did you think I would not protect the woman I intend to marry from the machinations of a desperate social climber?" The room went utterly silent. Alara felt her heart stop. Marry. He had said, marry. Aldrich turned from Lady Blackwood, dismissing her as though she were nothing, and crossed to where Alara stood frozen. He took her hand, his grip warm and steady, and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. "I had intended to do this properly," he said, "with flowers and music and a suitably romantic setting. But I find that I cannot wait another moment. Not when you stand here, surrounded by people who have spent years making you feel worthless, believing their lies about your own value." He dropped to one knee, there in the center of Lady Catherine Pemberton's birthday ball, with every noble family in the county watching. "Alara Weston, you have been ignored at every ball. You have been overlooked and dismissed and treated as though you did not exist. but I have seen you. I have seen your strength, your dignity, your courage. I have seen the woman you truly are, and I have fallen in love with her." Alara could not breathe. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. "Will you marry me?" Aldrich asked. "Will you be my Duchess? Will you stand beside me and show all of these people that their opinions mean nothing, that their judgments are dust, that love and worth cannot be measured by the standards of society?" Alara looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. She saw Lady Blackwood, pale and trembling, her campaign of destruction crumbling around her. She saw Lord Ashworth, her former suitor, his expression unreadable. She saw Lady Catherine Pemberton, whose birthday celebration had been completely overshadowed, and the guests who had spent years treating Alara as though she were invisible. And then she looked back at Aldrich, at the man who had seen her when no one else would, who had loved her when she had forgotten how to love herself. "Yes," she said, and her voice rang clear and strong across the silent ballroom. "Yes, I will marry you." Aldrich rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that scandalized half the room and moved the other half to unexpected tears. Around them, the whispers began again, but they were different now, tinged with wonder and grudging respect. The ignored widow was to be a duchess, and nothing would ever be the same. If this moment touched your heart, leave a comment now saying, "True love sees what the world refuses to see." Let me know that Alara's journey has moved you, that her triumph over those who dismissed her has given you hope. The wedding of Aldrich Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, to Alara Weston, widow of Sir Edmund Weston, took place on a morning in early spring when the first flowers were beginning to push through the thawing earth, and the air carried the promise of warmth to come. It was not a quiet affair. Aldrich had insisted on that. "They spent 3 years pretending you did not exist," he had said when Alara suggested a simple ceremony. "Now they will watch you become a duchess, every single one of them." And so invitations had been sent to every noble family in the county, to every lord and lady who had ever turned their back on Alara, to every person who had whispered behind their hands or excluded her from their gatherings. Attendance was not optional. To refuse an invitation from the Duke of Ashworth would be social suicide, and so they came, all of them, filing into the chapel of Ashworth Manor with expressions that ranged from resigned to resentful. Lady Blackwood was conspicuously absent. In the weeks since her failed attack at Lady Catherine's ball, she had retreated to her country estate claiming illness. The truth, as everyone knew, was that she could not bear to witness the triumph of the woman she had tried so hard to destroy. Alara stood before the mirror in her chambers, dressed in a gown of ivory silk that had been made for her in London by the finest dressmaker in England. It was nothing like the worn green dress she had worn for so many years, nothing like the careful mending and faded colors that had marked her as a woman of no consequence. This gown spoke of wealth and position and the love of a man who wanted the world to know her value. But what struck her most as she studied her reflection was not the gown or the jewels or the elaborate styling of her hair. It was the expression in her own eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she looked alive. A knock at the door announced the arrival of her attendant, a young woman named Mary, whom Aldrich had hired to serve as Alara's lady's maid. "It is time, my lady. His Grace is waiting." Alara took a deep breath, feeling her heart race with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "I am ready." The walk from her chambers to the chapel felt like a dream. Servants lined the corridors, bowing as she passed, their expressions warm with genuine welcome. She had won them over in the weeks since her engagement, not through grand gestures but through small kindnesses, remembering their names, asking about their families, treating them as people rather than furniture. At the doors of the chapel, Alara paused. Through the stained glass windows, she could see the shapes of the gathered guests, the colors of their finery muted by the colored panes. In a moment, she would walk through those doors and down the aisle toward the man who loved her. In a moment, she would become the Duchess of Ashworth. But first, she allowed herself to remember. She remembered standing at the edge of Lord Pemberton's hall, watching the others dance while she pressed herself against the cold stone wall. She remembered Lady Blackwood's cruel laughter, the deliberate cuts, the systematic campaign to erase her from society. She remembered the long nights in her tiny room above the seamstress's shop, mending gowns by candlelight, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. And she remembered Aldrich, appearing out of nowhere, looking at her as though she were the only person in the room. "You were the only one not performing," he had said. "You were simply yourself." Alara smiled, and the smile transformed her face from beautiful to radiant. "Open the doors," she said. The chapel was filled with people, but Alara saw only one. Aldrich stood at the altar, dressed in dark blue velvet that matched his eyes, his face alight with an emotion so pure and powerful that it made her heart ache. He watched her approach as though she were walking toward him out of a dream, as though he still could not quite believe she was real. The ceremony passed in a blur of words and music, of vows spoken and rings exchanged, of the weight of tradition and the lightness of love. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, Aldrich drew her close and kissed her, and the kiss spoke of everything that words could not express. Gratitude and wonder and the fierce determination to build a life together that defied everything they had been told they could not have. When they turned to face the assembled guests, Alara saw their faces anew. Some were smiling, genuinely happy for the couple at the altar. Others were neutral, having accepted the reality of the situation even if they did not celebrate it. A few were sour, resentful, unable to forgive Alara for rising above the place they had assigned her. But none of that mattered anymore. Alara was no longer invisible. She was no longer ignored. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, wife of the man she loved, and the opinions of those who had dismissed her for so long had become as meaningless as the wind. 3 months after the wedding, Aldrich and Alara hosted their first ball at Ashworth Manor. It was the event of the season. Everyone who was anyone clamored for an invitation, and Alara, who had once stood at the edges of other people's gatherings, hoping for a kind word or a friendly glance, now had the power to decide who would be welcomed into her home and who would be left standing at the gates. She used that power thoughtfully, deliberately, with a generosity that surprised those who expected her to seek revenge for the years of slights and exclusions. "You are inviting the Thorntons?" Aldrich had asked, raising an eyebrow at the guest list she was preparing. "Did they not refuse to acknowledge you at Lord Pemberton's Christmas dinner?" "They did," Alara agreed. "But their daughter Elizabeth was kind to me once, many years ago. She smuggled me a glass of wine when no one was looking and told me that she thought my gown was beautiful. I have not forgotten. And the Harringtons? I seem to recall they were among Lady Blackwood's closest allies. Lady Harrington was, but her son has recently married a woman of modest birth, and society has been cruel to them. I would like to show them that kindness is possible." Aldrich had smiled at her then, a smile full of pride and love. "You are remarkable, you know." "I am trying to be better than those who hurt me," Alara said simply. "I do not want to become what I despised." The night of the ball arrived clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Ashworth Manor glowed with candlelight, every window ablaze, every room filled with music and laughter. The guests arrived in their finest attire, their carriages lining up along the drive, their faces bright with anticipation. Alara stood at the top of the grand staircase with Aldrich at her side, watching as the ballroom filled below them. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, commissioned to match the family jewels that now adorned her neck and wrists. Her hair was swept up in an elegant arrangement, and she held herself with a poise that came not from years of practice, but from the simple knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. "Ready?" Aldrich asked, offering her his arm. "Yes," Alara said. "I believe I am." They descended the staircase together, and as they reached the ballroom floor, the assembled guests parted before them, bowing and curtsying as they passed. Alara saw faces she recognized, people who had ignored her, people who had been kind, people who had played no part in either her suffering or her salvation. She greeted them all with the same gracious smile, offering no favoritism and no grudges. But when she reached the corner of the room where a young woman stood alone, clearly uncomfortable in her obviously new gown, Ilara paused. "Lady Margaret," she said gently, addressing the young wife of Lord Harrington's son. "How lovely to see you. I do hope you are enjoying yourself." Lady Margaret looked up, startled. She was pretty in a quiet way, with brown hair and earnest eyes, and she reminded Ilara powerfully of herself as she had been 3 years ago. Uncertain, out of place, desperate to belong. Yes, Your Grace. Thank you for inviting us. It was unexpected." "Not unexpected at all." Ilara took the young woman's hand and squeezed it warmly. "I have heard wonderful things about you, Lady Margaret. They say you have been teaching the children of your husband's tenants to read. I would very much like to hear about that project, if you would do me the honor of sitting with me at dinner." The look of stunned gratitude on Lady Margaret's face was worth more than all the jewels in England. As the evening progressed, Ilara made a point of seeking out those who stood on the margins, those who watched the dancers with longing in their eyes, those who had been marked as outsiders for reasons of birth or circumstance. She introduced them to people of influence, drew them into conversations, made them feel seen and valued in a way that she herself had so rarely experienced. By the time the ball drew to a close in the small hours of the morning, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Ashworth Manor. The rigid hierarchies that governed English society seemed, for one night at least, to have loosened their grip. People who would never normally speak to each other were engaged in animated conversation. Alliances were forming across lines of class and status, and at the center of it all stood the Duchess of Ashworth, the woman who had once been invisible, now wielding her influence not to exclude, but to include. Aldrich found her in the garden as the last guests departed, standing by the frozen fountain where they had first spoken privately all those months ago. "You have done something remarkable tonight," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pressing a kiss to her hair. "I have done what I wished someone had done for me," Ilara replied. "Nothing more." "It is everything more." He turned her to face him, his dark eyes serious in the moonlight. "You could have used your position to punish those who hurt you. You could have built walls as high and impenetrable as the ones they built against you. Instead, you chose to open doors." "What good would walls do?" Ilara asked. "I spent 3 years behind walls of my own making. They did not protect me from pain. They only trapped me inside it." Aldrich kissed her then, soft and slow, with all the tenderness and passion that had marked their relationship from the beginning. "I love you," he said when they finally drew apart. "I love the woman you were when I first saw you, alone and proud and refusing to break. But I love even more the woman you are becoming, powerful and kind and determined to make the world better than you found it." Ilara felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, of overwhelming love for the man who had seen her when no one else would. "And I love you," she said, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for giving me the chance to become myself." They stood together in the frozen garden as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful from the ruins of loneliness and rejection. And Ilara knew with a certainty that went beyond words that the best of her life was still ahead. A year had passed since Ilara had first stood at the gates of Lord Pemberton's hall, invisible and ignored. A year of love and struggle and transformation that had changed not only her own life, but the lives of countless others. Ashworth Manor had become known throughout England as a place of welcome, a sanctuary for those who did not fit the narrow molds of society. Young women of modest birth found mentors and connections there. Scholars without patrons found support for their work. Artists and musicians who would have struggled in obscurity found an audience for their talents. The Duchess of Ashworth had become a force for change, and her influence rippled outward like circles spreading across still water. But on this particular spring morning, Ilara was not thinking about influence or change. She was sitting in the garden that had become her favorite retreat, a book open in her lap, watching the play of sunlight across the flowers that had just begun to bloom. She heard Aldrich's footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him, and she smiled without turning around. "You found me. I will always find you." He settled onto the bench beside her and took her hand, intertwining their fingers with the casual intimacy of long familiarity. "How are you feeling?" Alara placed her free hand on the gentle swell of her belly, hidden beneath the folds of her gown. "Hopeful," she said. "Nervous, grateful beyond words." The child growing within her was a miracle she had not dared to hope for, a gift that seemed to complete the transformation of her life from isolation to abundance. In a few months, she would be a mother. The woman who had been told she was worth nothing would bring new life into the world, would hold in her arms a child who would grow up knowing only love and belonging. "I have been thinking," Aldrich said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "about everything that has happened since we met, about how strange and wonderful and utterly unexpected all of this has been." "Do you regret it?" Alara asked, though she knew the answer. "Not for a single moment." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "But I do sometimes marvel at it. A year ago, you were standing alone at the edge of a ballroom, and I was newly arrived in a country I barely remembered, expecting to hate everything about my new life. And now we are here." Alara leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. Together, happy, about to become parents. "I never thought I would have this," Aldrich admitted. "I spent so many years convinced that love was a fiction, that marriage was merely a transaction, that true partnership was impossible in a world so obsessed with rank and fortune. And then you saw a woman in a faded green dress, standing by herself, watching the world dance past her. And I knew." His arm tightened around her. "I knew, from that very first moment, that you were different, that you were real, that everything I had been told about what to value in a wife was wrong, and that you were exactly right." Alara thought about the girl she had been, the lonely widow who had learned to expect nothing from the world. She thought about the walls she had built around her heart, the armor of composure she had worn like a second skin. She thought about how close she had come to accepting invisibility as her permanent fate. And she thought about how one moment, one man, one choice to accept a hand extended in the candlelight had changed everything. "I was so afraid," she said softly. "When you asked me to dance that first night, I was terrified that it was a trick, that you would humiliate me somehow, that this was just another way for society to remind me of my place. I know." Aldrich's voice was gentle. "I could see it in your eyes, the fear, the doubt. The desperate hope that you were trying so hard to suppress. But I danced with you anyway. You did, and in doing so, you changed both of our lives." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching a butterfly drift from flower to flower in the spring sunshine. The world seemed very far away, the gossip of society, the whispers of those who still resented Alara's rise, the constant demands of position and responsibility. In this moment, there was only the garden and the sunshine and the love they had built together. "I want to teach our child," Alara said eventually, "that worth is not measured by birth or fortune. I want them to know that kindness matters more than rank, that courage matters more than conformity, that the people who stand at the edges are often the ones most worth knowing. Then we will teach them together." Aldrich placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling the life that grew within. "We will show them a world different from the one we grew up in, a world where everyone is seen and valued and loved." Alara turned to look at him, at this man who had appeared out of nowhere and transformed her existence. His dark eyes held the same intensity that had captured her attention across that crowded ballroom, the same unwavering certainty that had given her the courage to take his hand. "Thank you," she said, and the words were wholly inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. "For what?" "For seeing me, when I was invisible, when everyone else looked right through me. You saw me." Aldrich cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "How could I not? You were the brightest light in the room. You were just surrounded by people too blind to notice." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Alara felt the last vestiges of her old fears dissolve like morning mist in sunlight. She had been ignored at every ball. She had stood in the shadows, watching life happen without her, wondering if she would ever find her place in a world that seemed to have no room for her. But she had survived. She had endured. And in the end, she had not just found her place, she had created it. She was Alara Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, wife and soon-to-be mother, champion of the overlooked and voice for the voiceless. She was proof that the world's judgments were not final, that invisibility was not permanent, that even the most ignored among us could rise to become exactly who we were meant to be. And this was only the beginning. 1 year later, the annual Winter Ball was held once again at Lord Pemberton's manor. But this time, everything was different. Alara descended the grand staircase on Aldrich's arm, wearing a gown of crimson velvet that matched the rubies at her throat. In the nursery at Ashworth Manor, their daughter, Charlotte, slept peacefully under the watchful care of her nurse. And all around them, the cream of English society watched with expressions that ranged from admiration to awe. The announcement rang out across the hall. His Grace the Duke of Ashworth and Her Grace the Duchess of Ashworth. Alara paused at the base of the stairs, looking out at the faces turned toward her. She saw people who had once ignored her, now eager to catch her eye. She saw people who had mocked her, now anxious for her favor. She saw, in the far corner of the room, Lady Blackwood, returned from her exile, watching with an expression of bitter resignation. And she felt nothing. No triumph, no vindication, no petty satisfaction at the reversal of fortunes. She felt only gratitude for the life she had built, for the man beside her, for the daughter waiting at home, for every painful moment that had led her to this place of love and purpose. "Are you ready?" Aldrich murmured. Alara smiled, and the smile transformed her face from beautiful to luminous. "I have been ready," she said. "My whole life." Together, they stepped onto the dance floor, and together they began to dance. Around them, the world watched. The old aristocracy and the new, the powerful and the marginalized, the included and the overlooked. And Alara, who had once been invisible, danced in the center of it all, finally, completely, gloriously seen.